But he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The word of the Lord. In the year 1899, after several days of torrential rain, the South Fork Dam of the Little Conemaugh River catastrophically failed. Surrounded by steep mountainsides in the hills surrounding Pittsburgh, the city of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, sat 14 miles downstream from the dam. When the levee broke on May 31st, it instantly released a surge of, they estimate, 112 million gallons of water upon Johnstown, sending a volumetric flow rate that temporarily equaled that of the Mississippi River upon its unsuspecting citizens. Over 2,000 people died in the Johnstown flood. Prior to the September 11th terrorist attacks, the Johnstown flood was the deadliest disaster in American history. Many of today's liability laws are the result of the flood victims failing to win suits against those whose negligence led to the dam's breaking. As David McCallum, a historian writing about the Johnstown flood, says, pictures and newspapers' accounts of the devastation fascinated the nation. A lot of preachers stepped up to their pulpits, delivering sermons on the meaning of the Johnstown flood disaster. The biblical story of Noah was read by many preachers who thought that their congregations were bothered by the question, why? Why did this happen? Why did God allow this to happen? How could a good God? Victims ridiculed the suggestion that preachers would interpret their misfortune as the wrath of God. As their eventual court battles would attest, the survivors of the Johnstown flood knew their suffering had been caused not by divine providence, but by the callous negligence of those in charge of the South Fork Dam. They blamed not the Almighty, but the robber barons, Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Mellon, and Henry Clay Frick, who, despite warnings, failed to keep the earthen dam at their elite fishing club in good repair. Maybe the Lord brought the rain, one survivor said, but those in charge made the suffering much worse. The flood had many people that night think that it was the judgment day, that the whole world was being destroyed, not just Johnstown. It had come as destruction from the Almighty, and it had been awful, and it had been God-awful. In this very same display of incomprehensible divine action that finally quiets the complaint of Job. Job, a man in the land of Uz, a man blessed with 7 sons and 3 daughters, a successful man in possession of 7,000 sheep and 500 oxen. And he was a righteous man, blameless and upright, who feared God above all else. And by God's decree, Job loses everything. His estate is taken from him by marauders. His home is burned. His family is killed by a devastating wind. And then Job is plagued as sores erupt all over his body. To make matters worse, in his suffering, Job is consoled by 3 friends who all have very empty explanations for what's happening. Eventually, Job explodes, mad at God for his poor job performance. Oh, that I have one to hear me. Let the Almighty answer me. Job's grievances stretch out for 35 long chapters in the book of Job. For 35 chapters, the book is nothing more than Job complaining about the cosmic injustice that he's suffering. It's important to point out that the book of Job is not an attempt to explain the mystery of suffering. Why do bad things happen to good people? It's not a biblical question. As Jesus himself says, no one is good but God alone. The book of Job also does not answer the modern question about God's existence. Is there a God in the world that has such suffering? The book of Job simply sets aside the question of what merits our suffering, and God's existence is taken for granted. So the book of Job is not an explanation. The book of Job is a rage against explanation. Job does not receive the reasons for his suffering, but Job does receive a revelation. As unbelievable as it is for us, the modern readers, that was enough for Job. Job finally responds to, I'm having trouble reading today. God finally responds to Job's pleas by appearing in a whirlwind, summoning Job to behold not only his own situation, but the entire creation. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? He's asked. Taken on one level, God's mighty reply to Job's complaints sound extraordinarily irrelevant. God never gives Job the answer that Job has sought, but taken on a different level, it makes Job's questions obsolete. God's answer for Job is no answer at all. Yet it satisfies Job totally. Job forgets all his suffering and grievances. Job abandons all the words he had uttered over those 35 chapters. Job replies, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Job has pleaded with God for answers about his trials and hardships. God does not give Job answers or explanations, but he does give him a new way of knowing, a new way of seeing the world, and of his place in it. He is not the only one to have this sense of understanding. From a prison cell that he in all likelihood would not leave alive, the Apostle Paul writes to the Philippians, for to me, living is Christ and dying is gain. What accounts for Paul's ability to center his life and death wholly in Christ, and to center his concern not on his life or death, but on the advancement of the gospel? Well, Paul, don't forget, lost nearly as much as Job. He lost his status in the community and all that came with that. He had been beaten and scorned. He'd been rejected by those who Christ had called him to lead. He'd been shipwrecked, attacked by lions, arrested at least 3 times, bitten by a snake. He'd lost his sight. And in the letter to the Philippians, he's about to lose his life. But all he cares about is the spread of the gospel. Paul has encountered the power and the majesty of God, and that has reconfigured everything for him. The God who can only be known by us by revealing himself to us. The God of wind and storm, fire and flood. The God who is infinitely greater than the sum of all natural phenomena put together. The God who knows the number of hairs on your head. And for some of you, it's a smaller number. But the same God who reveals himself to Job and the God who reveals himself to Paul is the God who reveals himself to you. Paul had been given a new way of knowing, a new way of seeing the world and his place in it. And his place in the world and your place in the world is in Christ. Paul doesn't mean that metaphorically. He means you belong to Christ. And because you are in Christ, the only difference between life and death is that in death, you will now see what in life you can only know by faith. Shortly after the Johnstown flood, Reverend T. DeWitt Talmage, a celebrated pastor in New York City, used Psalm 93 as his sermon text. The floods have filled up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. Mightier than the thunder of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. In his sermon to over 5,000 worshipers that Sunday, Reverend Talmage preached that those who want only the religion of sunshine, blue sky, and beautiful grass would soon discover that nature is merciless. Of course, we lack answers to the questions asked by a suffering world. We do not have any insight or understanding. We instead have a God who is beyond any of our understanding. That may sound unhelpful or odd. But the Apostle Paul from the prison cell reminds us that from the very beginning, Christians have found hope and taken comfort in the goodness of God, the incomprehensible glory that will be revealed to us in the future. If one day we shall know by sight the greatness of God, then in this age it can be known only by faith. Does faith mean that believers will always be spared from trials and from hardships? No. Does knowing how great our God is solve the problem of suffering or the mystery of evil? No. Does believing to live is Christ and to die is gain make living less of a struggle or dying no longer sorrowful? No. Job leaves from his encounter with the Lord with every single one of his questions still unanswered. Instead, God the Father has given us his Son, and his Son has given us the Spirit, 3 in 1, which may, just wait and see, reconfigure all your questions. Only the God who is beyond our understanding can save us. That is the God I believe we worship. In the name of the Father, and the Son,